I don't think any introduction can really do his career and his impact justice, but I will try. He is the Ralph and Ross Halbert Professor of Innovation at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. So he's fleeing the Canadian winter for a respite here. And he is also the Professor of Political Science and Canada Research Chair in Democratization, Health and Development. And he has made significant contributions in all of those research areas and continues to pursue an active research career in all of that. And I've just had a fascinating hour conversation with him about a lot of that work. He's also one of the few senior scholars in the United States who's doing broad comparative public policy work, but also has a strong grounding in Taiwan studies. And so it's for that reason as well that we're very glad to welcome him here. He did some significant research in Taiwan for multiple books, actually, but the one that's probably best known is a study of the development and evolution of health insurance policy in Taiwan and South Korea. He has a very well-known book on that. I could go through all of this, but I'll just say he's got 3 other books, 2 edited, one on dominant party systems, which is close to my own heart, and he's currently working on a book monograph with Daniel Slater at the University of Chicago, looking at pathways to democracy from single-party states, and that's going to be the subject of his talk today. So let me just say he also graduated from McGill University, bachelor's, so he did his undergrad in Canada, but then came south to the University of Wisconsin and finished with a PhD in political science there a little over a decade ago. So he's been very prolific, a very impressive career so far. And we get to hear the latest part of it. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Joe.
Thank you so much. That's extremely kind of you. It's an extremely kind introduction. It's really a privilege and honor for me to be sharing some of these ideas with colleagues and friends and former professors, John Emerson here of mine, sharing some of these ideas today. So, as Karas has indicated, what I want to present to you today are some ideas that are informing a book that I'm now writing with Dan Slater. And so, as with all books, one of the things that we're really concerned with is how do we frame this book, right? What is the large message that we want to convey? And one idea that we have, and because the book is far from being finished in its writing, one idea we have is to think of Asia as a region, as in many ways a kind of lab, to ask and answer age-old questions surrounding democracy and development. And one of the things that we want to stress, and one of the things that we see, are a kind of a competition between logics that are prevalent in the Asia region right now. On the one hand, you have the China story, and you have an expectation that the region is in many ways China's Asia, right? And you have the Beijing consensus, you have this idea of an authoritarian advantage. You look southward to parts of Southeast Asia, and you see the influence of China, and one way, therefore, of thinking about the region in democracy and development is to think about it in terms of China's Asia. Another way of thinking about it, and one that we want to stress, however, is that actually maybe it's Asia's China, and that actually what we see in Asia is a democratic Asia. Despite all of the, for instance, cultural expectations that were written about long before, we actually see a democratic Asia, not only a democratic Asia, but one that has a long history in the region. So our book actually goes back and looks at post-war Japan. In fact, we begin our analysis really in 1918. And moreover, democratic Asia in which democracy is not accidental, nor is it incidental, but rather what we want to present in the book is a coherent, and I think maybe in some ways in our, as we were doing the research for it, surprisingly coherent logic of democratic transformation. So that's kind of how we're framing the book, is that you have competing logics, and one of the logics is a logic of democratic transformation, and what we want to suggest is that it's actually a historical one and also a coherent one. So the motivation for the book is really about democratic possibilities. Right? That's how we're thinking about it. And as I say, the book begins with the story of Japan, and Larry and I were just chatting, you know, the way in which we cut into that Japan chapter is actually, we cut in at 1947, and we picked 1947 for a reason, because if you look at Japan and you take a snapshot of Japan in 1947, it really could have gone one of two ways. Right? We typically think of Japan as the post-55 Japan, in which we see democracy and we see a dominant LDP, but if actually you go back 8 years before, reverse course and so on, 1947 Japan, it could have gone both ways. And so we're really interested in the story of democratic possibilities, or impossibilities as it were. So let me give you a more contemporary example to try to illuminate the logic that we're talking about here, and I want to draw very briefly on the example of Indonesia. So in May of 1998, as we know, the Suharto regime is overthrown. And it looks like the end of Golkar. It looks like the end of the regime and also the end of the party. To make matters worse, what we see is Habibie taking over, who is by every measure a weak president. So from the outside view, what we see is basically a regime that is hanging on by a thread. Now the conventional wisdom, at least the theoretical conventional wisdom, would tell us that this regime would repress. That in the midst of crisis, a regime, particularly a party regime, will choose to repress. And Barbara Geddes writes about this in her seminal 1999 piece in her sort of State of the Literature on Democratization, which she says the preferences of party cadres are authoritarian party cadres are much simpler than those of military officers. Like democratic politicians, they simply want to hold on to office. So the expectation here is that in the midst of crisis, or military officers always have the barracks to retreat to, provided that they set the conditions effectively, but politicians want to hang on. And so we should therefore expect continued repression. In the case of Indonesia, however, rather than repress, we actually see Habibie expediting the elections, moving the elections from 2002 forward to 1999. If you think about it, in many ways it's counterintuitive. It's in some ways expediting his own defeat, right? Committing political suicide. Our argument, though, is that while Habibie is weak, the party, that is to say Golkar, is actually still relatively strong. And so therefore, by expediting elections to 1999, he's choosing to concede democracy when the party still has a chance. After all, this was a party that oversaw a developmental state. It was a party that enjoyed territorial advantage. It was a party that quickly moved to reforms around decentralization in order for it to capture the periphery. In other words, the 1999 elections, instead of 2002, were in many ways the best option for a weakened but still strong Golkar party. And indeed, as we saw, Golkar comes in second in 1999, becomes a major coalition partner, and comes in first in 2004. Now again, I tell you that story because theory would have predicted authoritarian repression under those circumstances, whereas we see under those circumstances democratic possibility. So our faith in democratic possibility is because democracies are, in the end, a function of choices. Right? I mean, you have to choose democracy. So democratic activists have to choose to take to the streets and fight for democracy. And as we know, I mean, that's a very difficult choice, evidenced by the blood, sweat, and tears that are expended as they hit the streets. And we've seen this in places around the world, including recently in Hong Kong. It's also a choice on the part of elites. And the argument we want to make here is that from the point of view of elites, choosing democracy is an extraordinarily difficult decision because you are now essentially inviting the inconvenience of the possibility of losing, maybe even retribution. Right? So if you're an elite, to choose democracy actually can be a very negative outcome for you. So the question we ask then is, why do some authoritarian regimes choose democracy instead of repress? But more specifically, we ask, why do relatively strong or still strong authoritarian regimes choose democracies when they don't have to? In other words, why do they concede democracy, i.e. the possibility of losing, when there is no immediate need to do that? We ask this question because in many ways it seems counterintuitive, and it seems counterintuitive because it is counterintuitive. As Geddes argues, parties concede only from a position of weakness. And you look around, and in many ways it makes sense. the Arab Spring, the color revolutions, and so on, what we see are regimes that are in imminent collapse, terrible crises, and it's only under those conditions do they concede democracy, essentially when they have no other choice. If you think about it, China is no different. If you look at this quote in the New York Times, and this was around the time of the umbrella protests in Hong Kong, you see in the New York Times, Beijing is also deeply averse to concessions that could diffuse the protests out of fear that the least sign of compromise would embolden other challengers across China. Right? So if you think about this argument, it's in many ways, so folks like Martin Jacques would say, look, the Chinese Communist Party is so powerful, it doesn't need to concede. And for those of you who are pushing for democracy in China while the CCP is so powerful, you're just simply Western imperialists and so on. And he even goes so far as to say those in Hong Kong are just jealous. Right? So the point here is that to make concessions is a reflection of weakness. If the Chinese Communist Party is to make a concession, it is effectively to concede weakness. Hence, if you think about it, the conventional wisdom in the China field is such that democratic possibilities in China will only emerge when the Chinese Communist Party is weak. If you look at the mainstream literature on democratization in China, the argument basically is democracy in China will come only with crisis and the imminent collapse of the Chinese Communist Party. And this is logically consistent, right? So defenders of Beijing would say, look, there is no need for the Chinese Communist Party or China to democratize because the party is still strong. And critics of Beijing would say, we should expect democracy to come at any moment because the party is terribly weak. Either way, the argument hinges on crisis, collapse, and weakness. The argument we want to make is that this actually isn't the only path. And it's not the only path because it's not the only choice. Now, Martin Jacques will tell you the Chinese Communist Party does not need to choose democracy because it's so strong. We agree. The Chinese Communist Party is strong. And one of its choices is to not choose democracy. But we want to argue that there's actually more than one choice. Authoritarian parties can choose to concede democracy in non-crisis situations. They can, and they have chosen democracy when the regime is still powerful. They can concede democracy from a position of strength, or as we put it, they can concede democracy from a position of confidence. In other words, it's not unreasonable, it's not implausible that an authoritarian regime concedes not to lose, but to concede democracy instead to survive or thrive. Thus, when Habibi concedes, he's not committing political suicide. Of course, it was a gamble, but there was reason, a glimmer of hope, for him to be confident, and indeed it pays off. So the point we want to make here is that despite the conventional wisdom which suggests that authoritarian regimes only concede during crisis times, we actually see the opposite. Authoritarian regimes can concede from a position of strength, and we run through various cases including Korea, Japan, and indeed the case that I want to talk about today, which is of course Taiwan. The argument we make about Taiwan, and Taiwan in many respects is the perfect case. It's the case that we inductively generate the entire theory. What we're saying here is that you can actually have an authoritarian regime that democratizes from a position of strength, from a position of confidence. And the best case, of course, is the KMT in Taiwan. By every measure, the KMT in Taiwan prior to democratic transition was a brutal regime. Right? In 1986, when the Democratic Progressive Party announces its formation in the Grand Hotel, most observers of Taiwanese politics expected, as Geddes would expect, the regime to repress. Right? But instead, what we see is the regime allowing the formation of the DPP, and of course, shortly thereafter, the lifting of martial law in 1987. And, as we know, Jiang Jingguo famously says, the times are changing, the environment is changing, the tide is also changing. The reason why we bring up the Taiwan case is that in many respects, the KMT did not have to concede. It was not in a crisis situation. It was extraordinarily powerful. Just a few years before, it was still ordering and successfully, executing executions around the world. It was a regime that could have hung on. But what we saw was CCK gambling. And for the fate of the party, it was a huge payoff. CCK